Gadgeteen is getting reworked as it has been one of the worst performing and least played traits so far in set 8. Currently in PBE, this is the change. Gadgeteen units will now gain bonus damage and damage reduction for items equipped to them. So I've been playing Gadgeteen on the PBE, and maybe it's just me, but Gadgeteen still feels absolutely terrible. Don't get me wrong, this change is definitely a step in the right direction, and having more damage and damage reduction is definitely useful and obviously makes the trait stronger. But firstly, I don't think these bonuses are enough, at least I haven't noticed them because they're literally impossible to notice. It's hard to tell if this trait is having an impact on your board because it's not very easy to see the effect of damage reduction and damage increase. This number is supposed to be bigger and this number is supposed to be smaller, but keeping track of these numbers is incredibly difficult. There's no tooltip saying how much of the bonus you've gained. And it's not clear if these bonuses apply to every item on all the Gadgeteen units and they all get the bonus, or does the unit gain bonuses based on how many items are currently equipped to that specific unit? I still don't know the answers, so if you do, please let me know. Secondly, having the units themselves be buffed doesn't really mean much in the grand scheme of things because you still want the option to strengthen other units with the Gadgeteen items. And vertical Gadgeteen still isn't viable because you still need to play units like Lulu and Poppy, which frankly aren't good units in the late game and limit options severely with what boards you can play. Your comp will suffer and there's only really a handful of times that you can really pull off a Gadgeteen board. For example, my carry here is LeBlanc, not any of the Gadgeteens. Rather, I'm using Zoe as a Morello applier because she's absolutely phenomenal at spreading her magic damage. I'm using Lulu to enable Heart and increase my team's AP, and I'm using Annie as my primary tank and to enable Spellslinger for LeBlanc. Zoe takes time to get through front lines, meanwhile boards like Star Guardians or Sure Shots will outscale and just wipe your board before that. So Hacker can be great in these cases for Omnivamp and backline access to their carries. Although Zoe may also need Prankster active to keep her safe. So that means that LeBlanc and Echo can almost feel necessary to play if you've got a Zoe carry. And Zoe clearly performs better with Blue Buff rather than Shojin, because Blue Buff gives you the option of using her as a Morello applier, or you can go for damage with Archangel or Heart Spat and Hextech Gunblade. Shojin on Zoe leans towards a damage build because she'll be casting less but she'll have more AP so she'll be burning for more. Also, one of the reasons why Lulu isn't a good unit late game is because you have to put her in the second row so she can reliably hit her secondary damage. If she's farther back then it may just not hit. So this means that late game, Lulu will be getting hit by all the CC and AoE abilities and she probably won't end up doing much for your board as her survivability is almost non-existent. Early game Gadgeteen can be very powerful because it gives you a very strong item that you can use however you want. And you only need to play 3 specific units, which isn't much of a problem in the early game. But late game, having 5 units that you have to play limits your options severely, and Nunu is a 5 cost, so he's rare and you may not be able to find him. To make this comp more viable later, you need to 3-star most of the units like Lulu, Poppy, Zoe, and other units like Rel or Yumi, which is a big ask. But even with that, the Gadgeteen damage is still weak late game. Zoe's burn can be out-healed if she doesn't have Morello or a Heart Spat, and in either case, you may need a Zoe 3 and time for her to scale. Lulu without items won't cast often enough to do anything impactful bar provide AP through Heart. Realistically, the only reliable damage is from Nunu. But while you're looking for Nunu, you will probably bleed out from not being able to kill enough units, and Nunu can only reliably stabilize your board if he's 2-starred, which you may not live to see. Both Lulu and Zoe were also buffed, so I do not imagine the issue was with the unit themselves, but the trait. Gadgeteen is a supportive trait that provides utility through its items, and late game Lulu, Annie, Poppy and Zoe can just be trait bots if they're not 3-starred. This isn't necessarily bad because these units can enable other great units like Alistair, LeBlanc, Sona and Soraka, but these units won't benefit from the new Gadgeteen bonuses. And I don't know if Gadgeteen should ever really be a really strong vertical trait that gives loads of power to the units themselves, because that will be way too strong on dominance, especially early game with both its utility and power. It'd also be too rewarding for how linear the playstyle and the comp is for Gadgeteen. On the other hand, if it became even more supportive, then it would reward flex play more and be less bland. Having a different item each round can be very difficult to play around as it may not have a suitable unit for that item, which may or may not be a Gadgeteen. Having the option of itemizing different units gives you way more freedom and room to play around and potentially shift the direction of your board depending on how you're rolling. In the case that you get an item you don't really get much value out of, you're kinda just screwed for that round, and this rework means you don't really want to put these items on units that aren't Gadgeteens because you'd be losing value. which is just bad because this restricts your freedom and choices. So the trait still feels weak and just doesn't compare to other verticals, considering how late it'll be before you can go 5 Gadgeteen and what units you need to play. Gadgeteen isn't a big vertical like Star Guardian or Spellslinger, and it clearly shows by how much of a gap there is between something like 5 Gadgeteen and 5 or 7 Star Guardian. Even without the trait, those Star Guardians are providing more value to your board as they all have great abilities, even at lower costs, like Rel's Armor Share or Nyla's AoE Heal. So of course I think that Gadgeteen isn't a major trait, and it's more along the lines of a supportive trait similar to Hacker and Prankster, in the sense that they support the units themselves and provide utility to the board. Now the problem is Gadgeteen also provides damage, which puts it in an awkward spot between being a support trait and a damage trait. Again, using Star Guardian as an example, you innately have 2 overlaps. Yuumi and Syndra with Heart, and Talia and Lux with Spellslinger. So you get these enabled with little to no effort when you're playing Star Guardian. On the other hand, Gadgeteen units have no other overlaps with each other, so it can be difficult to fumble together a comp from game to game. Just getting another Gadgeteen item and a boost to the damage and damage reduction is not enough to justify playing 5 Gadgeteen. The power gap is massive between 3 and 5 Gadgeteen, but 5 Gadgeteen is very difficult to hit, and you can be stuck at 3 Gadgeteen for most of the game. Likewise, the gap between 5 and 7 Star Guardian is massive, and your board becomes incredibly stronger at 7, but it's much easier to achieve 7 Star Guardian. The pathing is also quite awkward because you want to reroll for Poppy, Lulu and Annie 3, but you need to hit Nunu later. If you don't turbo high roll, chances are that you'll be too poor to ever see Nunu. Gadgeteen really suffers from being out of tempo with a lot of the other comps. Most comps fast 8 or reroll at 7 to stabilize, but for Gadgeteen it feels like you need to slow roll at 6 for Poppy, Lulu and Annie 3, roll at 7/8 for Zoe, LeBlanc or Alistair 3, and Echo or Talia 2, and then again at 9 trying to find Nunu 2. This is just way too demanding and impossible to realistically achieve. Even Gadgeteen Heart isn't enough because you still have to play Lulu or Poppy. And again, because there's no overlap with the Gadgeteen units, it's very difficult to invest much else into other traits, and you are forced to play very horizontally. So if you're against people playing big verticals like Duelist or Star Guardian, then you will lose most of the time because you cannot go deeper into Defender or Aegis. And because of the nature of TFT, you may be unable to run 5 Gadgeteen because of what you roll. In this PvE game, I was aiming to play 5 Gadgeteen. I was rolling really well until the hero augment selection, where I was given these choices and nothing for Gadgeteens. So I had to take the Soraka augment and pivot my board into 4 hearts. With this augment I played Soraka and Syndra when I should have played Alistair and Leona because they enable Aegis 3, Oxforce 2 and Mascot 2. And this is another problem with Gadgeteen. You'll probably be punished for being creative because this Gadgeteen comp may just be one of the most inflexible and specific comps in this set, which has been one of the most flexible sets of all time. Units like Alistair, Echo, LeBlanc and Sona are just too essential because they enable a lot of valuable traits and make up for what the Gadgeteen units lack. And the only other comp around Gadgeteen units doesn't even have Gadgeteen active. And it makes sense because once your carries and tank have their items, why would you need to use a random item every round? So even after this change, the Gadgeteen items still eventually become redundant. The identity of this trait needs to be changed to be more consistent with the supportive nature of the items. They could possibly provide the damage boost and damage reduction to the entire team like Scrap back in set 6, because playing this comp is very restrictive and even just 3 Gadgeteen late game is a massive commitment. But of course this change would probably make Gadgeteen very dominant in the early game. To prevent this, they can keep 3 Gadgeteen somewhat power neutral to what it is right now, but they should change Gadgeteen like they changed Underground and introduce a breakpoint at 4 Gadgeteen. This should make Gadgeteen less clunky and awkward to play, especially when you have 4 Gadgeteens that you want to play because they're 3-starred or enable synergies. And then eventually when you get Nunu, you can do more from there. Although I don't think there should be a breakpoint at 6 because you could start to get too many items. Maybe instead you could get a special bonus where the items last under the round or the trait bonuses are much larger. I don't know if 6 Gadgeteen is necessary, but there is some potential there for a cool bonus. Anyway, this Gadgeteen bonus should apply to the entire team, or at the very least Gadgeteen units and any units with the Gadgeteen item equipped to them. Alternatively, they could give the Gadgeteen bonus to everyone and the Gadgeteen units themselves get a little extra on top. And this is to stop the units themselves becoming completely overpowering with Gadgeteen enabled. It is just better in terms of balance, flexibility and fun if the bonus is shared and the power of Gadgeteen is distributed across your board. The goal is to fully itemize your units anyway. So later, you could use the Gadgeteen items for whoever is lacking items, and you can give them the power of the traits. Also, since you want to give your units their ideal items, the value of the random Gadgeteen item falls off hard late game and just isn't worth playing Gadgeteen for. But if giving this item to a unit also made them count as a Gadgeteen, but not towards the trait, and gave them the Gadgeteen bonuses, then that is definitely worth considering and potentially playing. Gadgeteen has a lot of potential and can be really fun, but the innate randomness to the item can really skew your board strength. I don't think the trait bonuses will ever be impactful enough to justify running unless it gave board-wide value like Scrap did back in set 6. There are units that can perform really well on a Gadgeteen board, especially with their hero augment like Sona, Soraka and LeBlanc. But I think even after this rework, you should still avoid Gadgeteen. You lose too much by playing it, and there's not enough value in the trait itself to make up for it. But I have faith in the dev team since it's taken the first step in making this trait better. And I'm looking forward to more changes because I think Gadgeteen has the potential to be one of the most fun traits in this set. And that's it. If you want to see more from me, then check out my video on what could replace FIBRE, and check out my video on whether the hero mechanic is good or not. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.